Joining us now to talk about the divorce of one Rupert Murdoch and Wendi Deng is Silvana Raso, head of Schepisi and McLaughlin's family law practice. And Silvana, welcome.
Thank you, Steve.
It's a pleasure to talk to you. Okay, so how what happens here? I mean, once she's married to him. Does it matter how long you're married, for instance? Are you entitled to the same amount? Does it matter whose fault it is in a situation like this? Or just once there's a divorce filed, then it's the same no matter what the circumstance?
Well, that's a good question, Stephen. It really depends on whether or not there was a prenuptial involved here, which we know that there was. Given Mr. Murdoch's considerable assets, given the fact that he was married to somebody 38 years his junior, given the fact that he had children from 2 prior marriages, and the fact that he'd been through 2 prior divorces, there was a prenuptial agreement, and that really will control what happens in this case. That's not to say the prenuptial agreements cannot sometimes be put aside,
right.
But what's going to dictate the division of assets in this case is what's contained in that prenuptial agreement, and rest assured, Mr. Murdoch has bought the best prenuptial agreement that money can buy, given his costly divorce from his second wife.
Okay, which means what? You mean he was very stingy in this go-round, or what?
Well, what it means is that he's anticipated what would happen if he decided to get divorced.
Right.
And everything in terms of alimony to be paid, division of assets, is going to be laid out in that prenuptial agreement, which nobody has seen yet, as to my knowledge. So that is going to dictate what she gets, what he pays. Whether or not fault plays a role in that is a very interesting question. Sometimes people ask, when we negotiate prenuptial agreements for them, to put in a clause that dictates that if there is fault by one party or the other, for example, if there is adultery by one party or the other, it will change the terms of what is distributed in the case of a divorce.
Now, didn't that used to, I'm kind of changing the subject a little bit here, we'll get back to this particular case, but didn't that used to be the case? When did no-fault divorce appear? Because I think it used to be, I mean, not that I followed divorce that closely until I had my own, but didn't it used to be that if there was a fault, then you had the advantage if you weren't at fault?
Well, actually, that's not really true. The fact of the matter is most states in this country have no-fault divorce, which means you do not have to prove why you are getting divorced. You can simply say, we're not getting along, and I don't want to be married anymore. That's no fault. Irreconcilable differences.
Right.
Things of that nature are considered no fault.
But if somebody cheated, then shouldn't they get less alimony or whatever's being split up or divided up? I mean, shouldn't that have a bearing?
Well, fault does not play a role in division of assets, believe it or not.
And that's always been the way it's been? Or that, like I said, is that really? Okay.
Yes. It can play a role in how custody is evaluated. For example, if one party is engaging in very disturbing behavior, that can obviously affect the custody situation, but generally it will not affect division of assets.
Interesting.
And that's always been the case. And there are many states that still allow fault divorce on the books in addition to no fault. So a party can plead, look, my husband cheated on me, my husband's an alcoholic. You just simply have to prove that that's true, but it won't make any difference whatsoever in what the other party's entitled to.
Interesting. We're talking to Silvana Raso, head of Schepisi and McLaughlin's family law practice. Did I say it right, by the way?
Schepisi and McLaughlin,
okay,
that's
good.
right.
All right. I give myself a pat on the back for that. So let's get back to the Murdoch situation here. The 6 children. What did I hear that something had to be paid off? Like the kids had to be paid off. Was it the other kids, the other 2 from the other marriage, or I mean, how did the kids enter into this, and how did they get put into a prenup if there's no kids? When you go into a prenup or whatever.
Well, what's interesting about this situation is that he had 4 adult children from 2 prior marriages. Right. So what happened was that the children from the prior marriages were made trustees of a trust of his assets. His 2 younger children with Wendi Deng were also made beneficiaries of the trust, although they don't have any voting rights. So they have a lesser right to control that trust than his older children do.
Okay, that's interesting. So what do you think I mean, like you said, nobody has seen the prenup, but based on the fact that you think now what you say based on his previous, what happened when he got divorced the last time, or the time before that you think he's really lawyered up and really got the best deal possible here in the prenup?
Well, there's no mistaking the fact that he's obviously a very smart man with considerable assets, and he'd have to be crazy not to have a prenuptial agreement in place, given the fact that he had 4 adult children, 2 prior divorces,
Right.
and considerable assets. He'd have to have his head examined if he didn't have a prenup. So everybody acknowledges that he did have a prenup,
Right.
and I'm sure he planned for this eventuality. It can happen to anybody. Nobody wants to think that. He knew the reality better than most people, so obviously he's planned for that. He paid considerable assets to his prior wife, considerable funds to his prior wife, probably not nearly as much as he could have paid if he didn't have a prenup with her, but in this instance, I'm sure he's well protected. What's interesting about the scenario is the fact that the information, the rumor that Wendi Deng had an affair with
Tony Blair, yeah.
Tony Blair was leaked. So obviously that was a very intentional leak, because normally high-profile divorces of this nature, people want to be discreet, they want to be amicable, they don't want the public to know their business. The fact that that information was leaked was very interesting, because it indicates that this is going to be a high-profile, messy divorce.
But why? But if there's a prenup, how could it be?
Well, it goes back to my original answer, which is perhaps, and this is just speculation,
Right.
perhaps the prenup dictates that if somebody was cheating,
Okay.
they might get less.
Gotcha. So he might, based on this leak, if in fact it is true, or and was leaked by someone in his camp, then that could be the plan. Let me ask you: if she had married him, or he has another wife, let's say next, he's going to marry somebody in a year, or when this is finalized, and they stay married for a couple of years, they have no prenup, or a couple of months. What is she entitled to then?
If somebody has a short-term marriage, their entitlement is far less than if it's a long-term marriage. This is, of course, without a prenup in place.
Right.
So in any situation, factors are very specific, and they dictate what somebody's entitled to. A short-term marriage, you're going to get less alimony and less assets than you're involved in a long-term marriage. But again, that's also very fact-specific, and it really depends on what people bring in to the marriage.
All right, divorce is a horrific thing, but unfortunately, it's prevalent, and that's what your expertise is. So I appreciate you sharing it with us, and thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me on the show.
My pleasure. Take care. Silvana Raso, head of Schepisi and